Well, let's continue talking about the Coalition's most recent housing policy, the one announced at its campaign launch yesterday. It would allow first home buyers to use some of their superannuation to buy a home. How will this policy affect women? Joining us now is the Senior Economist at the Australian Institute Centre for Future Work, Alison Pennington. It's terrific that you could join us this afternoon. Before we tease out the specific impacts for women, what is your view on this particular policy and how helpful it will be to first home buyers to get a foothold on the property market?
It's not a housing policy, is how I would start. It's being badged as one, but all it is doing is it's actually more about a superannuation policy. It's another early access scheme that the government has been introducing or trialling all through the COVID pandemic, whether it was early access in 2020 or they toyed with the idea for domestic violence victims. It's a superannuation policy about cracking open those savings and ploughing them into an already very hot housing market. So as a youngish person, looking at the state of the housing market for people my age, it's pretty clear that this policy isn't going to deal with the structural problems underpinning this very broken investor-dominated housing market at present.
And do you think it will affect men and women somewhat differently?
Well, it will inevitably do that because it's a superannuation policy, and because superannuation is a system that links into and reflects the inequalities in our broader labour market, it means that women are actually retiring with, 1 in 3 women are retiring without superannuation balances. There's the median savings of a women's superannuation account is half of that of men's. So any policy that says, here's a new, pool of funds for you to leverage to build more wealth out there in the housing market that builds out of a superannuation system, will be reproducing the same gender inequalities that are already baked into the super system. So we will see there'll be different impacts. At the younger age groups, it'll be less easy to see because a lot of young people stripped their superannuation accounts in 2020 under the early release scheme. 81% of all accounts that were stripped were from young people 35 and under. And then if you move up the age brackets through that scheme, more women of prime working age actually stripped their accounts entirely in a state of crisis, and often to keep up with their mortgage payments or their rent payments. So in short, I don't think this policy is going to help women in any way to more easily access housing and security in housing, importantly.
Well, you mentioned security in housing. For women and families, perhaps being able to put down that deposit, obtaining the security of their own home instead of a series of temporary rental ones, might for them make it worth it.
Well, I think you have to look at the fundamentals of it's not just that deposit that you need, and also 40% of an average women's super balance is only $17,000. So we're not talking about a lot of money. If you add on the average savings that a woman of that age would have, we're talking about an extra $8,000. So that's $25,000. That's nowhere near enough to even access a unit deposit for a median unit in somewhere in Melbourne or a major city. So then we have to be talking about wider savings and wider capacities to pay to get a deposit together. And we have to talk about jobs and jobs and incomes. And women are systematically working lower paid, more insecure jobs that are less likely to accrue superannuation and are less likely to have the security to build a savings blanket. So if we look at single parents, of which are disproportionately women, if a single parent was going to be able to access the housing market, they'd have to earn, on average, $90,000 a year, and that's $15,000 above what an average single parent earns at the moment. So, then we're talking about dual incomes, and to what extent is nailing, forcing dual income arrangements through contracts, like a mortgage contract, in many ways is like the new marriage contract. It binds people together for decades, the rest of their lives, paying off something that they may or may not finish at the end of their working lives. And I think in terms of women's wider economic security and physical security, those are not arrangements that are expanding women's opportunity or security.
Do you think if implemented, first home buyers will need to be asking themselves and weigh up whether they believe that their investment in their first home will return to them a bigger gain in the end, a capital gain on their outlay than what they would receive from their superannuation balance in terms of compound interest over many decades?
Well, actually, the Australia Institute's Matt Grudnoff has crunched some numbers today and has shown very clearly over a 10-year period the returns to a superannuation account using the average return in a balanced fund is much higher than it is for a housing deposit or accruing a home and waiting for capital gains. To follow that simulation, it requires people to believe and want housing prices to continue to increase. But for owner-occupiers, they should have no real interest in those conditions. For someone who wants to own their own home they live in, they like it because they live in a home. They're not thinking about how am I going to see the housing prices increase in such a way that allows me to sell this off? Because if you sell off that house, you have to buy back into that overheated market at a higher rate anyway. So I think the government is hoping that these kinds of policies reinforce the desire of people to become investors. And I think that we'll find more and more among young people and women that their biggest desire is to own a home that is secure and that is theirs, and extending on that, better quality rentals, through public housing provision, which is really low in Australia.
Just finally and briefly, one last question. Is there a guarantee that the price of a home is always going to return a windfall to the person who buys it? Is that price likely to always go up?
Well, if you follow recent Australian history, it's always trending up, but that's because our policies do that. We plough tens of billions of dollars through tax concessions, negative gearing tax concessions, capital gains tax concessions, and all of that. Our policies reinforce and signal investment into housing. It's not sustainable. We should be building an economy that isn't dependent on that kind of asset price inflation on an essential good. We all need homes to live in. We need to be talking about expanding our investment portfolio outside of housing, outside of mining. Certainly, superannuation is going to be an important part of that story. If we dismantle it now, we're in a weaker position when it comes to diversifying our economy and strengthening it into the future.
A huge topic. It's been terrific that you could join us. Alison Pennington, a senior economist at the Australian Institute Centre for Future Work. Thank you.